I'm gonna read a little bit. Making music, genuine music, is beneficial for everyone, but for Arcadians it is a necessity. We should not regard music, as Ephorus suggests in his preface, in an untypically hasty assertion, as a human invention designed merely to beguile and charm. Nor should we think that there was no thought involved when the ancient Cretans and Spartans replaced the trumpet as their timekeeping instrument in war with the pipes. Nor should we suppose that the earliest Arcadians had no good reason for incorporating music into Arcadian life so thoroughly that not only children, but also young men up to the age of 30 are required to make it their constant companion, even though in all other respects their life is very harsh. Their lives are very harsh. It is a familiar and well-known fact that, almost uniquely, Arcadian children are taught from their earliest childhood to sing in the prescribed manner the traditional songs and paeans with which each community hymns its local heroes and gods. Later, they learn the measures of Philoxenus and Timotheus, and every year they put on a keenly contested dance competition in their theaters, accompanied by pipe players supplied by the Guild of Dionysus. The contest has a junior section for boys and a senior section for young men. Moreover, throughout their lives, their entertainment in private social settings consist not of hired players, but of themselves, with each of them obliged. When his turn comes around to sing to the others, it is no disgrace in Arcadia to deny knowledge of any subject, but they cannot deny their musical abilities, since all of them have had to learn it. Nor is it acceptable for someone to give music up, because that is what is considered disgraceful there. The young men also drill to the accompaniment of rhythmically played pipes and practice their dancing in the public eye and at public expense on display to their fellow citizens. It seems to me that the men of old who introduced these practices had a very good reason for doing so. They did not consider music a superfluous luxury. They bore in mind, first, that people in Arcadia work as peasant farmers, which is to say that life is a hard grind for them, and second, that their characters tend towards dourness as a consequence of the cold climate and dank conditions that usually obtain in those parts. For all over the world, the people inevitably come to resemble the prevailing climatic conditions. This is the only explanation for the fact that people from different nations, or in general, different parts of the world, differ from one another in their characters, physiques, and coloring, and invariably in their ways of life, too. It was because they wanted to soften and temper the inflexibility and insensitivity of the Arcadian character that they introduced all these practices. And for the same reason, they also instituted the custom for both men and women of shared public meetings and sacrificial festivals, of which there are very many in Arcadia, and also festivals at which girls and boys dance together. In short, the sole purpose for which they were striving was to introduce practices that tamed and mitigated Arcadian obduracy. 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 I just, whoa, I didn't know it did that. I just got a haircut a day or so ago. But you can't really tell because it's blurry, but it looks really good in person. Okay. The Sinaithians, however, utterly neglected these practices, despite the fact that, because their climate and landscape are by far the most severe in Arcadia, they had more of this kind of help than anyone else. They put their energy only into mundane pursuits and concerns until, in the end, they became so savage that there is no Greek city anywhere in the world where worse and more constant crimes have been committed. There is clear evidence of the disgraceful state of affairs in Cynathia for this regard, and of the abhorrence felt by all other Arcadians and Cynathian ways. After the appalling massacre had taken place there, the Cynathians sent envoys to Sparta. Whenever in Arcadia the envoys stopped in the course of their journey, the inhabitants immediately expelled them, and the Mantineans, after getting rid of them, even conducted a ritual of purification by carrying slaughtered animals around the city and their entire territory. I hope to have said enough on this to make my points. First, people should not think badly of the Arcadian character as a whole because of just one city. Second, no Arcadian should begin to despise this aspect of their society in the belief that musical matters are superfluous and overdone there. Third, if God willing things ever improve in Cynathia, people there should tame themselves by acquiring an interest in culture, and especially musical culture. This is the only way in which they will ever be certain of not repeating the savagery that occurred there then. Anyway, so much by way of discretion about Cynathia and its circumstances. Now I shall resume the narrative. The Aetolians were already safely home from their Peloponnesian campaign when Philip arrived in Corinth at the head of an army to help the Achaeans. Since he was late, he sent couriers around to all the members of the alliance, asking each state to send representatives to him at Corinth for an urgent meeting to discuss what plan of action would best serve their common interests. Then he left Corinth for Tegea because he had heard that civil unrest and bloodshed had broken out in Sparta. The system to which the Spartans were accustomed was monarchy with unquestioning obedience to their kings. At the time in question, Antigonus had recently helped them to gain their liberty, and now that they had no kings, no one wanted else to have more political power than himself, and the infighting began. At first, three of the ephors inclined towards siding with the Aetolians, since they believed that Philip was too young to be an effective protector of the Peloponnese, while the other two did not commit themselves. But then the Aetolians left the Peloponnese sooner than expected, and Philip made his way there from Macedon even more quickly. Under these circumstances, the three ephors became suspicious of one of the other two, Adamantus, who knew he knew what they were up to, but withheld full approval, and they were worried that he would divulge everything to the king now that he was nearby. After secret meetings with some of the members of the armed forces, then they made a public announcement that all men of military age were to assemble under arms at the precinct of Athena Calciocus, at the precinct of Athena Calciocus, in response to the approach of the Macedonians. The order was so unexpected that it was quickly carried out. Adamantus was unhappy with these developments and stepped up to address the crowd. My view, he wanted to say, is that this announcement and the mustering of the army should have happened before, when we heard that the Aetolians were approaching our borders, not now at news of the approach of the king at the head of an army of Macedonians. The Aetolians are our enemies, while the Macedonians are our benefactors and saviors. But while he was still warming up, the soldiers who had been primed to do so fell on him and stabbed him to death. They also killed quite a few of their fellow citizens, including Sthenelaus, Alcamenes, Thyestes, and Bionides. Polyphontus and some others had had the sense to foresee what was going to happen, and had already left and joined Philip. Immediately after these assassinations, the ephors, by virtue of their office, sent messengers to Philip charging those they had killed with treason, and asking him to delay his arrival until the city had recovered from its current turmoil. They also asked him to rest assured that it was their intention to observe all their obligations and courtesies towards Macedon. The messengers found Philip at Mount Parthenium and delivered their report as ordered. After listening to what they had to say, Philip asked them to hurry back to Sparta. They were to inform the ephors that he would carry on and halt at Tegea, and that he expected them to send him there at the earliest possible opportunity, a committee with sufficient authority to discuss the current situation with him. The Spartan agents carried out the king's instructions, and in response, the ephors sent a 10-man commission, who made their way to Tegea and were received by Philip. In this meeting, with Omius as their spokesman, they accused Adamantus of responsibility for the unrest, guaranteed to do all that they were obliged to do by terms of their alliance with Philip, and assured him, as he would see, none of those who were taken to be his true friends would outdo them in expressions of gratitude towards him. After giving After giving Philip these assurances and others to the same effect, the Spartans withdrew. The members of the king's council were divided. Some felt that the Spartans were being devious, that Adeimantus had been killed for favoring Macedon, and that the Spartans had already decided to form a coalition with the Aetolians. They advised Philip to make an example of the Spartans and to treat them just as Alexander the Great had treated Thebes, right at the beginning of his reign. But the more senior members of the council argued that this would be an excessive response to the situation. They suggested that Philip should merely punish the ringleaders and, once they were out of his way, entrust the government to Sparta to his friends. The king had the final word, if the views he expressed on this occasion can be said to be his. After all, it is unlikely that a 17-year-old boy could think clearly about such weighty matters. But we writers are obliged to attribute to the overall leader the views that prevail in councils. Nevertheless, readers may well suspect that his recommendations and decisions stemmed from those who were present at this meeting, and especially from those who were closest to him. In this case, it is probably Aratus to whom the king's views should be attributed. Anyway, Philip said that in cases where allies were fighting among themselves, but the violence was not spreading, he should do no more than make his views known, by speech or by letter, and suggest remedies. It was only if the alliance as a whole was affected that the situation should meet with a common response, and that the remedy should be applied by the whole alliance. Since it was not clear that the Spartans had done anything to damage the alliance as a whole, and since they were promising to fulfill all their obligations to him, it would be wrong of him to act uncharitably in their case, and he added that it would be odd for him to take harsh measures against these Spartans for such a trivial reason. When his father had treated them to the utmost leniency, even after conquering them as enemies, the king's view met with the council's approval, and they decided to overlook what had happened. Philip immediately had one of his friends, Patrius, accompany Omius back to Sparta to urge the people there to see that they remained on good terms with himself and the Macedonians, and to exchange oaths of alliance. Then he broke camp and returned to Corinth. His decision about the Spartans gave the allies a fine illustration of his principles. By the time Philip reached Corinth, all the representatives from the members of the alliance had arrived, and he convened the conference to decide, with their help, what was the appropriate response for them to make to the Aetolians. The Boeotians accused the Aetolians of plundering the sanctuary of Athena Aetonia during peacetime. The Phocians denounced them for assaulting Ambrisus and Daulis in an attempt to annex them, and the Epirots charged them with having raided and ravaged their land. Then the Arcadians explained how the Aetolians had organized and executed an audacious night attack on Therium. Finally, the Achaeans gave an account of the Aetolians' occupation of Clarium in Megalopolitis. Finally, the Achaeans gave an account of the Aetolians' occupation of Clarium in Megalopolitis, of the plundering of Patrae and Pherae on their way, of the sack of Cynathia, of the theft from the sanctuary of Artemis at Lucy, of the siege of Clyder, of the naval attempt on Pylos, and of the joint Aetolian-Illyrian land assault on newly resettled Megalopoli, with the intention of depopulating it again. After listening to these grievances, the assembled representatives voted unanimously to go to war with the Aetolians. They prefaced the decree with a list of these charges and added a writer to the effect that they had also voted to restore to the appropriate members of the alliance any land or community occupied by the Aetolians since the death of Philip's father Demetrius. By the same token, they also promised, in the case of those who had been forced by circumstances to join the Aetolian League against their will, to restore their ancestral constitutions and allow them to retain their lands and cities ungarrisoned, except from tribute free and subject to the political and legal systems of their fathers. They also included a clause undertaking to recover for the Amphictyonic Council. They also included a clause undertaking to recover for the Amphictyonic Council its traditional privileges and authority over the Delphic sanctuary, which was now in the hands of the Aetolians. who had no intention of losing control of the sanctuary. This decree came into force in the first year of the 140th Olympiad, and so began the social war as it is known. The war was justified, a fitting response to the crimes that had been committed. The first task of the conference was to send League agents to the Allies to see that the decree was validated by the popular assemblies of each state, so that they could then present a united front in initiating war against the Aetolians. Philip also wrote to the Aetolians, informing them of the charges against them and telling them that if they wanted to try to justify their actions, they could still meet for discussion and reach a settlement. But it would be sheer stupidity on the Aetolians' part, he wrote, to suppose that they could get away with pillaging and plundering everyone with no prior public declaration of intent without the victims retaliating, and it would be equally stupid of them to think that if the victims did retaliate, it was the victims who were to be regarded as the instigators of war.